Welcome to Forgotten Fronts, Warfare Across the Ages. I'm your host, and here we explore the battles, leaders, and strategies that shaped our world. From ancient empires to modern conflict, we break down how warfare forged power, redrew borders, and changed history. Welcome to the front lines. Can you guys believe that we are already on episode 3? That feels absolutely insane to me, but thank you guys for coming along with the ride. One of the things I keep noticing as I study different conflicts is how often preparation is shaped by memory. It's not strategy alone and it's not technology alone, but it's memory. What happened before, what hurt the most, what leaders and nations become determined to never experience again. And in many ways, that instinct feels completely understandable. If something catastrophic happens, especially on a national scale, of course you want to make sure it can't happen again. You obviously want safeguards, defenses, certainty, but somehow history has a way of complicating that instinct. Because the next conflict rarely looks like the last one. And that idea is what drew me to the Maginot Line. Not because it's an unfamiliar story. Most people have at least heard the name. But because the deeper you look at it, the more it feels less like a military mistake and more like a very human one. France didn't build the Maginot Line out of arrogance. They built it out of experience. World War I devastated the country. Entire regions were destroyed. Millions were dead or wounded. Communities were permanently changed. And after living through that kind of war, it makes sense that French leaders wanted something solid. Something visible. Something that felt like protection, that was concrete, steel, engineering, a system that could stand between them and another invasion. What stays with me about this story isn't just that the Maginot Line was bypassed, it's the realization that preparation itself can create assumptions. When you invest time, resources, and belief into a system designed to stop one kind of threat, it becomes easier to imagine that threat as the most likely one. Over time, that expectation can narrow how you interpret risk. The Maginot Line was not weak. It wasn't poorly built. And in many ways, it worked exactly as designed. But warfare had changed and evolved around it. And what I find compelling about this story is how quiet that shift must have felt at first. No dramatic collapse, no catastrophic explosion of the fortifications themselves. Just the gradual realization that the battlefield had moved somewhere else. That the strongest defensive system in Europe was still standing, but no longer central to the fight. It makes me think about how often preparation gives us confidence, how often structure gives us reassurance, and how rarely we question whether those preparations are flexible enough to evolve alongside the world around them. The Maginot Line isn't simply a story about a defensive system. It's a story about expectation, about adaptation, and about the challenge of preparing for futures we can't fully predict. So today, we're stepping into that moment, into that memory of one war, the preparation for another, and the strategic shift that reshaped how the defensive system would be remembered. So, let's go back in time. It's May 1940 in northern France. Spring has returned to the European countryside. Fields are green again and villages are active. Rail lines carry supplies, soldiers, and civilians, moving through routines that still feel familiar. But beneath that normalcy, a new war is already unfolding. German forces have crossed into Western Europe. Operations against the Netherlands and Belgium are underway. The strategic picture appears to be developing along lines that feel recognizable. A northern advance echoing the opening movements of 1914. For French planners, this is expected. Contingencies exist, and mobilization plans are in place. Allied coordination assumes that if Germany attacks, it will do so through Belgium once again. And so attention is focused north. But hundreds of kilometers to the southeast, another movement is beginning to take shape. Reports begin arriving from the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes is not empty terrain. It is a region of dense woodland, narrow roads, and rolling hills stretching across Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeastern France. For decades, it has been viewed as unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. Movement would be constrained, supply would be difficult. Armored formations would struggle to maintain momentum. In planning assumptions across multiple Allied staff, the Ardennes represents terrain that slows war down. But in May 1940, the forest is not slowing movement. It is concealing it. German armored columns advance along winding roads beneath tree cover. Vehicle after vehicle emerges from Luxembourg into the forest corridors. Traffic jams form, but discipline maintains the flow. Camouflage reduces visibility from the air, and momentum builds gradually then steadily. What appears improbable begins to become real. A concentration of mechanized power is moving through terrain considered strategically marginal. Behind this unfolding movement stretching across French-German frontier stands the most sophisticated defensive system in Europe, the Maginot Line, a network of reinforced fortifications, underground facilities, artillery positions, and defensive infrastructure designed to prevent another invasion across the eastern border. For years, it had symbolized preparation. It symbolized security, and it symbolized deterrence. But it is not simply a defensive system. It is reassurance made visible. But as German formations pushed through the Ardennes forest, the strategic geometry of the battlefield begins to shift. The Maginot Line still stands. Its guns remain operational, its garrisons remain prepared, yet the focal point of the conflict is moving away from it. The defensive system built to stop invasion is about to confront a challenge it was never designed to face. Not direct assault, but maneuver. The Maginot Line will not be destroyed. It will be outflanked. To understand why the Maginot Line existed, it's necessary to step back more than 2 decades to the end of World War I. In 1918, France emerged victorious, but victory did not feel triumphant. It felt exhausted. The war had consumed the country physically, economically, and psychologically in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Nearly 1.4 million French soldiers were dead. Millions more were wounded, many permanently. Entire communities had lost large portions of their male population. A demographic imbalance lingered for years. Across northern and northeastern France, the landscape itself bore scars of industrialized warfare. Fields were cratered by artillery, villages reduced to rubble, forests shattered by shell fire, railways twisted, factories destroyed or looted during occupation. Large areas of farmland became what was known as the Zone Rogue, regions so contaminated by unexploded ordnance, chemical residue, and battlefield debris that cultivation was considered unsafe for years. Reconstruction would take decades. But physical reconstruction was only part of the challenge. The war embedded itself into French collective memory. Memorials appeared in town squares across the country, listing the names of the dead, often representing entire generations lost within single communities. Schools, churches, and civic spaces incorporated remembrance into daily life. World War I was not a distant historical event for France in the 1920s and 1930s. It was recent, it was personal, and it was still ongoing. For French military planners, one memory stood above the others: the rapid German advance of 1914. German forces had swept through Belgium and into northern France within weeks of the war's outbreak. Despite eventual stabilization of the front, the opening phase demonstrated how quickly modern industrial armies could penetrate national territory. Occupation of French land lasted years. Economic disruption was severe. Civilian populations lived under foreign control. That experience created a strategic priority that would dominate interwar planning. It would prevent another uncontrolled invasion, and French leadership recognized that geography alone could not provide security. Diplomatic arrangements offered uncertainty, and alliances offered potential support, but mobilization timelines remained a concern. Time to mobilize, time to coordinate allies, time to react became the most valuable commodity in French strategic thinking. If a defensive system could slow an invading army, even temporarily, it could transform the opening phase of a future war. Delay could become advantage. This logic did not emerge suddenly. Throughout the 1920s, debates occurred within French political and military circles regarding how best to secure the eastern frontier. Some advocated mobile defense and offensive doctrine. Others emphasized technological and structural solutions that could compensate for demographic and economic constraints. France faced a strategic reality. Its population was smaller than Germany's, and long-term industrial competition posed risks. A fortified defense system offered a form of force multiplier. Infrastructure could compensate for manpower, engineering could compensate for uncertainty, and so, gradually, a concept was formed. A defensive network that would protect key sectors of the border, channel enemy movement, provide protected firing positions, and most importantly, it would buy time. It would buy time for mobilization. It would buy time for coordination, and it would buy time for survival. This concept would eventually take physical form as the Maginot Line, named after French Minister of War André Maginot, who became a prominent advocate for its construction. But before it became concrete and steel, the Maginot Line existed as an idea rooted in memory, an idea rooted in trauma, and an idea rooted in rational fear. It represented France attempting to convert the lessons of one war into safeguards for the next. The Maginot Line was therefore not merely infrastructure, it was reassurance. A nation that had endured catastrophic invasion sought certainty and permanence. Permanent walls, permanent bunkers, permanent artillery, permanent subterranean complexes, and structures that would stand where soldiers once fell. Preparation made visible, and for many in France, preparation felt like security. By the late 1920s, the concept of a fortified defensive system along France's eastern frontier had moved beyond abstract planning and into political reality. But the Maginot Line was not universally accepted from the start. Its construction required enormous financial investment. It represented a long-term commitment to a particular vision of warfare. And like many large military projects, it existed at the intersection of strategy, politics, economics, and public perception. Debate emerged across French political and military circles. Supporters argued that fortification offered stability. France faced demographic limitations compared to Germany. Its population had been deeply affected by World War I losses. Infrastructure, therefore, could serve as a compensatory advantage. Fortifications could reduce the manpower required to defend critical sectors. They could provide protected artillery positions resistant to bombardment. They could channel enemy movement into predictable avenues where mobile forces could respond. Opponents, however, expressed concern. Some military thinkers feared that heavy investment in fixed defenses might encourage strategic rigidity. They worried that reliance on fortifications could reduce emphasis on maneuver, mobility, and offensive capabilities. Others questioned the cost. The French economy in the interwar period faced reconstruction demands, social spending pressures, and political fragmentation. Funding a vast defensive network required justification beyond military planning. Amid this debate, one figure became closely associated with the project. André Maginot, a veteran of World War I and later French Minister of War, emerged as a key advocate. Maginot was not an abstract bureaucratic supporter. He had been wounded during the war. He understood firsthand the consequences of modern industrial conflict. For Maginot, fortification represented not merely strategy but prevention, a means of avoiding the uncontrolled devastation France had experienced. His advocacy helped consolidate political momentum. Public support also played a role. Memories of the war remained vivid. The idea of visible defensive preparation resonated with a population that had endured invasion, occupation, and loss. By 1930, funding was approved and construction began. What followed was one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of the 20th century. The Maginot Line was never intended to be a continuous wall. Instead, it was conceived as a layered system of defensive complexes, infrastructure, and supporting positions integrated across terrain. Major fortified structures known as ouvrages formed the backbone of the system. These were not simple bunkers, they were underground fortresses. Beneath the surface, extensive tunnel networks connected combat blocks, barracks, ammunition storage areas, power generation facilities, and transportation systems. Electric railways operated within these subterranean corridors, allowing supplies and personnel to move without exposure to enemy fire. Ventilation systems were designed to withstand gas attacks, a reflection of World War I experiences. Water supply, food storage, medical facilities, and living quarters allowed garrisons to operate independently for extended periods. Above ground, retractable steel turrets housed artillery pieces capable of emerging to fire and then withdrawing back into armored protection. Machine gun positions, observation posts, anti-tank obstacles, and reinforced concrete combat blocks provided layers of defensive capability. Armor thickness, structural reinforcement, and dispersion of key components were engineered to resist sustained artillery bombardment. The design philosophy emphasized survivability. Rather than relying on exposed defensive lines, the Maginot Line embedded its strength underground. For soldiers assigned to these positions, daily life bore little resemblance to traditional frontline services. Living quarters were located deep below ground level. Lighting was artificial. Movement occurred along rail corridors. Routine maintenance, drills, and monitoring replaced constant exposure to combat. In many ways, the system represented a hybrid environment, part military installation and part underground city. The psychological dimension was significant. For France, the Maginot Line symbolized preparedness. For the soldiers stationed within it, it offered protection unmatched by the trenches of the previous war. Confidence in engineering translated into confidence in endurance. Construction continued throughout the 1930s, with major sectors reaching operational status as European tensions increased. However, even as concrete hardened and steel turrets were installed, the Maginot Line reflected a specific strategic expectation. It was built primarily along the German border. Its strongest sectors faced east. Extensions toward Belgium existed, but were less extensive, shaped by diplomatic considerations and assumptions regarding Allied cooperation. The system, therefore, embodied not only engineering decisions, but geopolitical ones. Where fortifications were built and where they were not, revealed how France anticipated the next conflict would unfold. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Maginot Line stood as the most advanced defensive system in Europe. Technically sophisticated, extensively funded, and operationally prepared, it represented the culmination of interwar strategic thinking. A nation that had suffered invasion sought security and permanence, but permanence, as history would demonstrate, carries its own vulnerabilities. By the late 1930s, the Maginot Line stood ready. Its fortifications were operational. Garrisons were trained. Artillery positions were integrated into defensive planning. But military infrastructure does not exist in isolation. Its effectiveness depends on how planners believe war will unfold. And in France, those expectations were heavily shaped by memory. The dominant strategic model remained the experience of 1914. German forces had advanced through Belgium. The northern plains had become the avenue of approach. Combat stabilization only after rapid maneuver and initial territorial loss. For French planners, this pattern remained logical. If Germany attacked again, Belgium would likely serve as the corridor. This assumption shaped operational planning across Allied staffs. In the event of German aggression, French and British forces intended to move forward into Belgium to meet the advance. The objective was to prevent fighting from occurring deep inside French territory. Belgium itself presented a diplomatic complication. Fortifying the Franco-Belgian border too heavily risked signaling distrust towards a neutral state and potential ally. As a result, the northern extension of the Maginot Line was comparatively limited. The strongest defensive sectors remained concentrated along the direct German frontier. Strategic planning, therefore, rested on a combination of fixed defense and mobile response. The Maginot Line would secure the eastern border. Mobile forces would maneuver north to confront and advance through Belgium. This framework appeared coherent. It aligned with historical precedent. It integrated alliances. It balanced infrastructure with maneuver capability. But within this structure lay an assumption rarely challenged: that Germany would repeat its previous operational pattern. Assumptions are not inherently flawed. They allow planning. They enable resource allocation. They provide conceptual clarity. But when assumptions become expectations, flexibility can narrow. The Ardennes forest represented one such expectation. Stretching across Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeastern France, the Ardennes was characterized by dense woodland, limited road networks, and uneven terrain. Large-scale armored maneuver through the region was widely considered impractical. Movement would be constrained, supply lines vulnerable, traffic congestion was likely. In operational planning, the Ardennes functioned as a natural obstacle. Not impossible, but unlikely to serve as the main axis of advance. This perception influenced force allocation, prioritization, and defensive posture. It was not ignorance, it was interpretation. German planners recognized this interpretation. Within German strategic discussions, an alternative concept began to emerge. Rather than repeating the predictable northern thrust, German forces could exploit Allied expectations. General Erich von Manstein proposed concentrating armored divisions and pushing through the Ardennes forest. The concept carried risk. Dense terrain could create bottlenecks. Air attack might disrupt movement, and if detected early, the concentration could become vulnerable. But it also offered potential advantages. It offered surprise, it offered operational shock, and the opportunity to rupture Allied cohesion. If armored forces could emerge from the Ardennes and cross the Meuse River near Sedan, they could enter open terrain behind Allied forward positions. From there, rapid maneuver could encircle forces advancing into Belgium. The plan did not seek to defeat the Maginot Line directly. It sought to make it strategically irrelevant. The contrast between approaches reflected a broader doctrinal divergence. French planning emphasized structured defense, mobilization timelines, and controlled response. German planning increasingly emphasized operational tempo, concentration of mechanized power, and exploitation of uncertainty. Static strength confronted mobile opportunity. Fortification confronted maneuver. Expectation confronted innovation. And in May 1940, these competing visions would collide not along the fortified frontier, but within the wooded roads of the Ardennes River. And in May of 1940, those competing visions would collide not along the fortified frontier, but within the wooded roads of the Ardennes forest. In May of 1940, German forces entered the Ardennes forest. What had existed as a concept within planning documents now became physical movement across terrain long considered unsuitable for large mechanized operations. Columns of vehicles advanced along narrow forest roads, tanks, armored cars, artillery, supply trucks, motorcycles carrying dispatch riders. The density of movement created inevitable congestion. At times, long lines of vehicles stretched for kilometers. Halted temporarily as bottlenecks cleared or bridges were crossed. From above, had Allied air reconnaissance been able to fully observe and interpret the scale of concentration, the vulnerability might have been apparent. But camouflage, weather, terrain, and interpretation all contributed to incomplete understanding. The movement continued. Discipline maintained flow, and engineers cleared obstacles. Traffic control units directed columns through the forest corridors. The very terrain considered restrictive provided concealment. Within days, German armored formations approached the Meuse River near Sedan. The Meuse represented a natural defensive barrier. Rivers historically slow offensive momentum. They create choke points. They require engineering solutions. French defensive positions along the Meuse near Sedan existed, but were not structured to confront the scale and tempo of the approaching concentration. Air operations began to shape the battlefield. German aircraft conducted sustained attacks against French defensive positions, communication nodes, and artillery sites. Bombardment created disruption not only physically but psychologically. Noise, shock, and uncertainty affected coordination. Under this pressure, German forces initiated crossing operations. Engineers deployed pontoon bridges, assault elements crossed by boat, bridgeheads were established on the western bank. Crossing a river under fire represents a vulnerable moment in offensive operations. Once initial footholds were secured, additional units flowed across. Bridgeheads expanded, defensive resistance fragmented, and momentum accelerated. The breakthrough near Sedan did not represent a single dramatic collapse. It was a process. Pressure was applied, positions were degraded, coordination was strained, and momentum was gained. As armored units moved beyond the river line and entered open terrain, the operational implications became immediate. German forces were now positioned behind Allied forward elements, advancing into Belgium. The geometry of the campaign shifted rapidly. The focus of maneuver moved west. Armored divisions advanced with increasing speed toward the Channel coast. Encirclement began to emerge not as a theoretical possibility, but as an unfolding reality. Throughout this movement, the Maginot Line remained intact. Its fortifications stood, its garrisons maintained readiness, its artillery remained functional, but the central contest of the campaign was no longer oriented towards it. The battlefield had moved. The strongest defensive system in Europe was now positioned away from the decisive axis of maneuver. Many units stationed within the Maginot Line would never engage in direct large-scale combat during the critical opening phase of the campaign. Their strength remained real, but relevance diminished. The breakthrough at Sedan did not destroy the Maginot Line. It transformed the strategic environment around it. For the soldiers stationed inside the Maginot Line, May 1940 did not begin with chaos. It began with routine. Life within the fortifications operated according to structured schedules. Maintenance checks, equipment inspections, drills, communication monitoring, meals served in underground facilities. These were not exposed frontline positions in the traditional sense. Deep beneath reinforced concrete and steel, garrisons lived within controlled environments designed for endurance. Artificial lighting replaced sunlight. Ventilation systems circulated air through protected corridors. Electric rail systems transported supplies through subterranean tunnels connecting combat blocks and support areas. Sleeping quarters, kitchens, medical stations, and command centers formed a self-contained ecosystem. In many ways, the Maginot Line offered conditions far removed from the trenches of World War I. Protection was tangible. Confidence in engineering translated into confidence in survivability. For the soldiers stationed within these positions, the defensive system represented preparation fulfilled. If conflict came directly to them, they were ready. Their artillery positions were protected, their observation posts integrated, their infrastructure designed to withstand bombardment. But war does not always arrive where preparation expects it. As German forces advanced through Belgium and the Ardennes forest, information reached the garrisons gradually. There were reports of movement, updates from command, fragments of operational developments. At first, these updates aligned with expectation. Combat in Belgium, Allied forward movement, contact with German forces, but then the pattern began to shift. Reports emerged of German breakthroughs near Sedan. Armored formations advancing westward, communication disruptions across sectors. The information did not arrive as a single dramatic announcement. It accumulated. Indications that the decisive movement of the campaign was occurring beyond the fortified frontier. Inside the Maginot Line, daily routines continued. Equipment still required maintenance. Positions still required readiness. Observation posts still scanned the horizon. Yet the operational context was changing. The enemy was not approaching from the expected direction. Instead, German forces were moving behind the fortified sectors. The realization would have been subtle, not a moment of collapse, not immediate panic, but a gradual awareness that the strongest defensive system in Europe was no longer positioned at the center of events. For soldiers trained to defend against direct assault, the concept of strategic bypass carried a different kind of uncertainty. Their positions were intact, their weapons were functional, their defensive design was validated, but their role was diminishing. They were prepared for battle. The battle was moving elsewhere. The psychological weight of that realization is difficult to quantify. To serve within a system representing national preparation and to recognize that preparation no longer defined the battlefield created a quiet tension. The Maginot Line had not been defeated, it had been avoided. And for those inside it, waiting underground while maneuver unfolded beyond their sectors, the war became a story of observation rather than participation. As German armored formations advanced west from Sedan, the operational picture evolved with extraordinary speed. Units that had crossed the Meuse River pushed through open terrain with increasing freedom of maneuver. Road networks that might have slowed movement instead facilitated momentum. Command structures struggled to respond to developments occurring faster than the established planning cycles had anticipated. Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium under the expectation of a northern confrontation now faced a shifting reality. German spearheads were moving behind them. What had begun as a breakthrough became exploitation. What had appeared localized became systematic. Encirclement is not always a single decisive maneuver. It is often the cumulative effect of movement, disruption, and tempo. Communication lines were strained, and coordination faltered. Positions once considered secure became exposed. The campaign in Western Europe during May 1940 became defined by this acceleration. Operational surprise translated into strategic advantage, and throughout this unfolding movement, the Maginot Line remained physically intact. Its fortifications stood where they had been built. Its garrisons maintained readiness. Its artillery remained capable. Yet the decisive contest of the campaign occurred beyond its strongest sectors. The defensive system designed to prevent invasion had become peripheral to the invasion that was unfolding. The Maginot Line did not collapse. It was overtaken by events. Today, the Maginot Line still exists. Concrete fortifications remain scattered across landscape. Steel turrets sit embedded in hillsides. Underground corridors that once housed soldiers now stand quiet. What was once a symbol of preparation has become a historical artifact, a reminder not simply of a campaign, but of a mindset. To me, the Maginot Line represents a nation determined to prevent the past from repeating itself. That nation invested resources, engineering, and belief into building something meant to stand between memory and future conflict. And to be very honest, in many ways that effort succeeded. The fortifications endured, the soldiers stationed within them fulfilled their roles. The system itself remained intact, but history moved around it, the battlefield shifted, and assumptions evolved. And the defining contest of the campaign unfolded beyond the strongest defenses in Europe. The Maginot Line was never destroyed. It was simply outpaced. And perhaps that is why it continues to resonate, not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder that preparation alone cannot guarantee relevance. Preparation alone can lead to rigidity. Strength without flexibility carries limits, and that in warfare across the ages, the most defensive changes are often not those that break defenses, but those that redefine where defenses matter. Thank you guys for listening. Until the next time, I will see you on the front lines.